Welcome to my discussion today. We'll be talking about the standards of education, a look at standardized testing in the United States. Our topics of discussion today will be support for standardized testing, opposition for standardized testing, and the question of are standardized tests focused effectively for what they are meant to achieve. To begin with, a little background. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, nearly 60 million students will be attending our elementary, middle, and high schools across the country this year. That is the largest number of students that they've had yet, and the number is expected to grow in the future. That is strictly, by the way, that is public and private schools, my apologies. Here on the screen, you can see the breakdowns of how each of those numbers correlate to the various grade ranges. Now, standardized testing is handled by the U.S. Department of Education. This particular group has been around since it was about 1980. Before that, it was actually a part of a group of departments that were combined together. So only since 1980 have we been focusing on education as its own department. On the screen here, we have examples of some of the information that the Department of Education gathers using the standardized tests given to students throughout the year. We see the averages for the testing between the years of 1992 and 2017 at the top. In the bottom left, we see, using the state of Texas, my own home state, as the center example, the method or the measurement of Texas against other states and how they test, with darker states being higher, scoring higher, the mid-tier blues scoring lower, and the closer to whites being right around the same area as Texas. In addition, we can see to the right of that where the average scores for the state versus the national average have been over the years. Now, the important thing to understand about this, why this background matters, is that the mission statement for the Department of Education is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. Now, first we're going to be discussing pros, the things that people discuss for how the testing is a good thing. The big thing is objectivity. In the examples that we are given here, this is specifically Indiana for 2019. Indiana recently replaced their iStep Plus testing with the iLearn testing. The new iLearn actually has a much larger collection of questions that are given to the students depending on how they do on previous ones. The difficulty rises as they show the ability to handle the new level of difficulty. What this means is that this particular test is purely electronic. There is no concern about who is taking the test or where they come from. It is purely an academic example to show what the student is learning. This is in difference to the previous iStep test, which, because it was a consistent test, there was less about what the student necessarily learned and more about what the student may have memorized. That's a topic we will come back to later on. The important point of this, though, is that even as the grades dropped from the change of one test to another, it still shows the information that the government is looking for and can use that now to determine, well, it looks like maybe a little more work needs to be put into English and math and maybe science for the state of Indiana. That's information that they need to know, that their students need to know, and hopefully means that they'll be better in the future. Now, before we get into the negatives, the arguments against the testing, we need to discuss momentarily James Samuel Coleman, the author of the Coleman Report in 1966. This gentleman, at the request of the Office of Education at the time, created a 737-page report from a variety of sources as far as surveys, data gathered before then. Just months and months were spent on this in order to determine whether or not the education system at the time was fair, was doing its job. And what he had found was that there was significant evidence of an achievement gap between black and white students, which could measure up to several grades on average. This now, according to Mr. Coleman, this particular gap wasn't the school's fault, but rather it was to do with the backgrounds of the students, the socioeconomic differences. Basically, the idea is the more money you have, the farther you get. And Mr. Coleman, after his survey and the report that he returned into to the government, this is basically what created the system that we use now, where testing is done in order to determine who basically needs help more, as far as the schools go, in order to bolster the ability of the students. While the students may have a rough background, is basically what Mr. Coleman was feeling, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways in order to bring them up to the level of others. Now, with that said, this is what we're looking at now as far as the achievement gap goes. Now, despite what Mr. Coleman had said about what we needed to do in order to correct it, as you can see here, based on some of the more recent numbers, this now, admittedly, this is 2010 that we're looking at here as the most recent. However, we can see, based on the graph on the left, that white students in blue are still measuring significantly higher than the Hispanic and black students in green and yellow, respectively. On the right-hand side, we actually see these averages broken down per state, with the red dots on the left representing the black students, and on the right representing Hispanic students. The gray dot is the average for each state, and the blue dot is the white population. Basically, what this is telling us is that while objectivity may be the purpose of these tests, it's still not doing enough, according to the opponents of standardized testing, to give everyone a fair shake at a proper education, effectively. Now, even as we look at whether the pros and cons of standardized testing, the question remains is, are those tests actually measuring what they intend to? Again, we refer back to the U.S. Department of Education's mission, which was to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness. Now, in these numbers here for 2015, we see that the United States, at their score of 496, is a full 60 points below the top of Singapore in science. Mathematics, they're 470 versus Singapore's 564, is nearly 100 points. And reading, 497 to 535, isn't much better. Now, that isn't to say that we're not doing well. Obviously, there are other countries that are below that point. But many question as to whether or not these differences in our location versus the top is an indication of whether there is more that can be done. On the right-hand side, we actually see the breakdowns of the countries, visibly, with green countries being the scores above 500 on average, yellow being between 450 and 500, and red being below 450. Now, the United States is one of the yellow countries, with several green countries that are assigned that others are graded higher in the worldwide ranking as far as those scores go. Now, we come back again to Indiana, and the reason for that is that As I was talking about before, there is the concern about whether or not students are learning the information or if they are just memorizing it. One of the concerns with the standardized testing is that because it is so consistent, some feel that the tests are being taught, that basically the teachers are teaching to the test rather than teaching to educate the children. This particular example here is actually being used as an example of that, with the lower grades across the board representing the fact that in those particular categories, students knew less and memorized more, and that's why they were lower in general. Whether or not that's true or not, we'll see in future years, but it is being used at this moment. Now, the opposite of teaching to the test is not teaching what's not on the test. Uh, are life skills, things that people need not necessarily to answer a test, but to survive. There's concern that not enough effort is put into things like communication or soft skills, financial and social skills, analytical skills, as well as just basic homekeeping, home economics, laundry, cooking, things like that. Here we have some recommendations um, to the U.S. Department of Education about categories of skills for success that could be taught to our students, to our children, in order to improve not just the quality of their educations on small, on small scale on those tests, but also in the grand scheme of things. Over here on the right, we see where academic and professional success is the top of the pyramid, but there are skills required in order to build that up. We'll see how that goes as well. Uh, I'm going to leave you today with a quote from Marian Wright Edelman. Education is improving the lives of others and for leaving your community and world better than you found it. I chose this one because that is essentially what the Department of Education is promising us with their mission, is that we are ensuring equal access to our children, that they all have a chance to live brighter tomorrows than we did and our parents before us. Um, I'd like to thank you for your time in listening to my talk today, and I would like to give a special thanks to the websites and individuals listed here who I have borrowed both information and images from in order to share them with you today. Thank you very much for your time again, and have a good day.